He had built fences around his land, and even stronger walls around his heart. But on a stormy night, a woman's desperate knock threatened to break them both. The wind swept across the wide, barren plains, carrying with it the sound of nothing but silence. The ranch stood in lonely defiance against the vast Montana sky, its wooden fences creaking, its barns weathered and tired. Once, this place had been alive with laughter, the steady hum of chores done together, the smell of bread drifting from the kitchen, the soft hum of a woman's voice. Now, it was only a hollow shell of what it used to be. Inside the main cabin, Jacob Walker moved like a shadow through his own home. A tall, rugged man with a strong frame hardened by years of labor. His eyes carried a weight of sorrow too heavy for words. His late wife's picture still hung above the mantel, though the glass was clouded with dust. He had not touched it in months. Perhaps he couldn't bear to. To Jacob, every corner of the ranch reminded him of her absence. The silence in the kitchen where she used to sing, the rocking chair by the fire that no longer swayed, the empty space on the bed beside him every night. The ranch was alive with work, but dead with spirit. Horses still needed feeding. Cattle still needed tending. The fences still broke and needed mending. Jacob did it all, his movements precise and mechanical, as though he were a machine. He spoke little to no one, never went into town unless necessary, and when he did, people whispered behind his back, "That poor man still hasn't healed." He didn't care. Let them talk. Let them pity. His world was small now, reduced to chores and grief, and he intended to keep it that way. His morning routine was as unchanging as the rising sun. Wake before dawn, brew black coffee in silence, step outside into the crisp cold air, boots crunching against the dirt, feed the horses, repair the worn fences, check the water troughs. There was no laughter, no voices calling his name, no warmth waiting when he came back inside. Just the crackle of a lonely fire and the echo of memories he tried too hard not to remember. The men in town often asked him if he'd ever consider hiring help, but Jacob always refused. The truth was, he had no desire for company. He had once loved deeply, and when that love was ripped away from him, it left a scar too deep to risk reopening. He told himself he was better this way, alone, hard and unreachable. Better to guard what little heart he had left than lose it again. But silence is a cruel companion. At night, when the ranch grew still and the coyotes howled in the distance, Jacob lay awake staring at the ceiling. The house seemed to breathe with emptiness. Sometimes he thought he could still smell her perfume faintly in the air, or hear her soft laughter in the creak of the porch swing. Other nights, the silence pressed against him so heavily it felt suffocating. He would clench his jaw, turn his back to the empty pillow beside him, and remind himself, "This is my life now. This is all there is." The ranch itself mirrored his soul. Fields that once bloomed were now dry and neglected. Fences leaned like tired soldiers, and the barns seemed to sag with the weight of abandonment. Even the horses sensed it. They were restless, as though longing for joy that once filled the land. Jacob did enough to keep everything alive, but never enough to make it thrive. That, he believed, had died with his wife. Neighbors tried in the early days. They brought him food, offered to sit with him, invited him into town for suppers. He turned them all away, cold but not cruel, with a hollow look in his eyes that said, "Don't try to save me." Over time, they stopped trying. He preferred it that way. The fewer people around, the less chance of anyone breaking into the locked cage he had built around his heart. And so the days passed, one after another, in a monotonous rhythm. Work, silence, sleep, repeat. There was no plan for the future, no hope for change. Just a man, a ranch, and the ghost of a love he could never forget. What Jacob didn't know, what he couldn't possibly imagine, was that the silence of the ranch would not remain forever. Fate had a way of testing even the strongest walls, of sending storms to the most guarded hearts. And his storm was already on its way, in the form of a desperate woman who would one day knock on his door, shivering, soaked, and pleading for shelter. The storm rolled in heavy, with thunder growling across the endless sky and rain hammering against the windows like 1,000 desperate fists. The cabin walls shuddered under the force of the wind, and Jacob Walker sat alone by the fire, sipping his black coffee. He had seen storms before. The ranch had weathered worse. But tonight, the silence inside the house seemed louder than the roar outside. The shadows flickered along the log walls, and for a moment, he thought of how his wife used to hum during nights like these. He quickly shoved the thought away, his jaw tightening as he stared into the flames. Then it came, a knock, hard, urgent, desperate. It cut through the storm like a cry for help. Jacob froze, his hand tightening around the mug. Nobody came out here, not this late, not in this kind of weather. For a second, he thought he had imagined it. But then it came again, louder, more frantic, the sound of someone pounding at his door as if their very life depended on it. Reluctantly, he rose. His boots hit the wooden floor with a slow, heavy rhythm as he moved to the door. He pulled it open with a swift motion, bracing himself against the wind. And there she was, a woman, drenched head to toe, her hair clinging to her face, her eyes wide with fear and exhaustion. She looked young but worn, as though life had chased her into this storm. Her lips trembled as she spoke, her voice nearly drowned out by the rain. Please, please, I need shelter. Just for tonight. Jacob's first instinct was to shut the door, not because he was cruel, but because he had vowed never to let anyone into his life again. Company meant complications. Complications meant pain. But as the lightning cracked across the sky and the woman shivered in front of him, hugging something close beneath her shawl, he realized he couldn't do it. He couldn't leave her out there to face the storm. He stepped aside grudgingly. Get in. His voice was rough, cold, like gravel dragged across stone. She didn't hesitate. She slipped inside, dripping rain onto the wooden floor, her breathing shaky and uneven. Jacob shut the door behind her, shutting out the storm, though a different kind of storm had now entered his cabin. For a long moment, silence stretched between them. The firelight flickered, casting her trembling figure in warm shadows. She hugged herself tightly, avoiding his gaze, while he stood with arms crossed, watching her like a man who didn't trust the world. You can sit, he muttered finally, nodding toward the chair by the fire. She lowered herself into it, still shivering, her eyes darting around the cabin as if afraid of what she might find. Jacob tossed her a wool blanket from the shelf. Dry off. Don't touch anything else. Her fingers clutched the blanket, grateful, though his tone made her flinch. She pulled around her shoulders, and for the first time, he caught the faintest glimpse of the woman beneath the storm. There was strength in her eyes, but it was buried under layers of fear, exhaustion, and secrets she wasn't ready to share. You picked the wrong ranch, Jacob said flatly, returning to his chair by the fire. I'm not in the business of keeping company. Her voice was soft, but steady when she replied. I wouldn't be here if I had anywhere else to go. The words hung heavy in the air, mingling with the crackle of the fire and the howling wind outside. Jacob didn't ask questions. He didn't want to. The less he knew, the easier it would be to send her on her way once the storm passed. But despite himself, he noticed the way her hands shook, the way she pressed the blanket close, as if trying to protect something more than herself. His instincts told him trouble had walked through his door. His heart, the one he had buried long ago, whispered something else entirely. For now, he told himself, it was simple. The storm would end. She would leave, and his ranch would return to silence. But deep down, Jacob already knew. Nothing about this midnight knock was simple. The storm outside had quieted into a steady drizzle, but inside the cabin, the silence was sharper than any thunder. Jacob leaned back in his chair, staring at the flames as though they held every answer he'd ever refused to ask. The woman sat across from him, wrapped in the wool blanket, her hair damp, her eyes heavy. She looked fragile in the firelight, like someone on the edge of breaking, but there was a steel edge beneath her trembling. He could see it in the way she clutched the blanket, in the way she fought to keep her chin from dropping. She was holding herself together, barely, but with the strength of someone who had fought too long to let herself crumble now. Finally, she broke the silence. Her voice was soft, roughened by the storm, but steady. I wasn't lost in the rain, she confessed, her gaze fixed on the floorboards. I was running from a place I swore I'd never go back to. Jacob didn't speak. He didn't ask. but his eyes flickered toward her, steady and unreadable. She took that silence as permission to continue. I had a home once, a husband who promised safety, a family that claimed to love me. But promises turn to chains when they're used to keep you trapped. Every word turned to lies. Every day turned to bruises. Her voice cracked, and she drew in a shuddering breath, her knuckles whitening around the blanket. Jacob's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He had learned long ago that asking questions meant carrying answers you might not want. Still, something in her trembling hands pulled at him. He rose without a word, went to the trunk by the wall, and pulled out a folded shirt and a pair of trousers, clean though rough spun. He set them on the table beside her. These should fit. Change before you freeze. His voice was low, gruff, but not unkind. She blinked at the gesture, as if shocked that this stranger, this hard-eyed rancher, would care whether she froze or not. When she reemerged from behind the screen in his dry clothes, she looked smaller, softer, but her shoulders were a little straighter, her breath steadier. Jacob had set a plate of beans and cornbread on the table, the kind of meal he made for himself out of habit, nothing special. Still, when she sat and took the first cautious bite, she closed her eyes as though she hadn't eaten in days. "Thank you," she whispered. 2 simple words, but heavy with meaning. Jacob only grunted, retreating to his chair again. Yet for the first time in years, he felt the faintest flicker of something he thought had died inside him. Humanity, faint but alive. The fire crackled between them, warming not just a cabin, but the unspoken space that was beginning, slowly, reluctantly, to thaw. The storm had passed, but the air around the cabin still carried its weight. For days, the woman, Clara, as she finally told him her name, kept mostly quiet, respecting the silence that seemed to cling to every corner of Jacob's ranch. Yet silence didn't stop her hands from working. On the second morning, Jacob walked into a small kitchen to find the table wiped clean, the hearth swept, and a pot of stew simmering slowly. He frowned, unused to anyone moving about his space, but when Clara glanced up with a timid smile and said softly, "I thought you might want something warm after chores," he didn't have the heart to stop her. It became a rhythm, gentle but steady. Clara moved through the ranch as though trying to repay her stay in small kindnesses. Feeding the chickens, patching a tear in Jacob's shirt, stacking firewood with careful hands. Jacob never asked her to, but he found himself watching her, silently noting the way her presence breathed a kind of life into places that had long felt dead. The cabin that once echoed only with the creak of wood and the sigh of wind now carried faint hums of her voice, the quiet clink of dishes, even soft laughter when a stubborn goat nipped at her skirt. And though Jacob never laughed out loud, his lips would twitch against his will, a crack forming in the armor he had worn for too long. Evenings grew softer. They shared meals by firelight, simple food, beans or cornbread, but somehow it tasted fuller when eaten together. Sometimes Clara would speak, telling him small stories of her childhood, her hands busy mending a sock while the fire flickered across her face. Other nights, they sat in companionable quiet, the sound of rain tapping the roof or coyotes howling in the distance. It was in those silences that Jacob felt something unfamiliar. Peace. For years, silence had been a punishment, an echo of all he had lost. But now, with her near, it became comfort. One night, Clara laughed, an unguarded, musical laugh that filled the cabin when Jacob's old hound dog sneezed so loud it nearly toppled his bowl. Jacob froze, startled by the sound. It had been years since laughter had touched these walls. Slowly, almost awkwardly, he let a small smile pull at his mouth. Clara noticed, her eyes widening as if she'd witnessed something rare. For the first time, the hardened rancher's mask slipped, just enough to reveal a man who was still capable of warmth. And though Jacob said nothing, deep inside he felt it, the first stirrings of a heart learning how to beat again. The night was quiet, the kind of stillness that pressed heavy against the heart. Jacob sat on the porch, hat pulled low, staring out at the endless sweep of stars. He didn't notice Clara until she stepped outside, a shawl around her shoulders, her footsteps hesitant. For a while, they both sat without speaking, listening to the crickets and the soft creak of the wooden boards beneath them. But something in the air shifted. Clara's presence wasn't just company, it was invitation. Jacob's chest tightened with the weight of words he had buried for years. His voice, when it finally came, was low and rough. My wife, she died right here. A fever took her so fast I couldn't. He stopped, his throat closing. Clara's eyes widened, her breath catching. He forced the rest out, each word heavy with guilt. I should have done more. Found a doctor sooner. Stayed awake longer. But I failed her. And since then, I swore I'd never let anyone close again. Because if I couldn't protect her, how could I protect anyone? His knuckles whitened as he clenched his hat, the pain raw in his eyes. Clara listened, her hands trembling in her lap. Slowly, she whispered her own truth. I know what it feels like to be unwanted. My husband left me when I couldn't give him what he wanted. Said I was useless, a burden. People I thought would stand by me, they turned away. I've been discarded so many times that I stopped believing I deserved a home. Her voice cracked, and tears slipped down her cheeks, falling silently into her hands. For a moment, the rancher and the woman sat there, stripped of all defenses, their brokenness laid bare in the moonlight. Jacob turned to her then, his hardened expression softening. Tentatively, almost afraid, he lifted a rough hand and brushed her tears away with his thumb. His touch was gentle, careful, as though he feared she might break. Clara closed her eyes at the gesture, leaning ever so slightly into his hand. In that fragile moment, words weren't needed. They had become something neither of them expected, keepers of each other's wounds. For the first time in years, Jacob's chest didn't feel so hollow. And for the first time in forever, Clara felt that maybe she wasn't unwanted after all. The small town was alive with whispers when Clara walked through its dusty streets. Women turned their heads, voices dropping to cutting murmurs. Stray woman, picked up from nowhere. Another muttered, she'll bring trouble to his land. Clara kept her eyes down, but the sting of their judgment burned deep. She had lived with rejection before, but somehow, hearing it here, where she had begun to feel a sliver of belonging, cut sharper than ever. Jacob heard the words, too. He stood beside her, his jaw tightening, fists clenching at his sides. For years he had kept himself, avoiding quarrels and town talk. But now, as the gossip poisoned the air around Clara, something broke inside him. He stepped forward, his voice steady but fierce. She's under my roof, under my care. If you've got words against her, you've got words against me. The street went silent. It was the first time in years he had spoken with such conviction, and Clara's heart trembled, not with fear, but with an ache she couldn't name. That night, the conflict escalated. A few drunken ranch hands, rivals who had long envied Jacob, rode up to the ranch, mocking. So the mighty widower takes in strays now? Thought your land was cursed, but looks like you just needed a woman to patch it. Their laughter echoed in the dark. Jacob moved to confront them, but before he could, Clara stepped forward, fire in her eyes. Say another word, she snapped, holding a lantern high, and you'll answer to me. The men sneered, but her defiance startled them. When one reached for his gun, Jacob tensed, yet Clara, quick and unflinching, flung the lantern down, flames erupting across the ground and forcing the men back. Her courage had turned the tide, saving Jacob from a fight that could have ended in blood. When the dust settled, Jacob looked at her differently, not as a burden, not as a guest, but as a force, someone who carried strength he hadn't dared to see before. They stood close, hearts pounding from the confrontation. Silence charged between them. His hand brushed hers, and she didn't pull away. For a breathless moment, his gaze dropped to her lips, the storm in his chest quieting into something softer, deeper. It wasn't a kiss, not yet, but the nearness was enough to set both their hearts ablaze. In the lingering firelight, Jacob whispered, almost to himself, "You're not trouble, Clara. You're the courage I lost." And though the moment passed, neither could deny that something unspoken had finally been born between them. The night was quiet, broken only by the soft hum of crickets and the distant rustle of wind across the plains. Jacob sat on the wooden porch, boots planted on the step, a glass untouched in his hand. The moonlight painted the ranch in silver, softening its edges, making it look less like a place of sorrow and more like a place that could, perhaps, hold peace. Clara stepped out quietly, her shawl draped over her shoulders, and settled beside him. For a long while, they said nothing, the silence wrapping them in a strange kind of comfort neither had known for years. Jacob's gaze was fixed on the horizon, but his voice was low when it finally broke the stillness. "They told me I should never love again," he admitted, each word trembling with the weight of years held back. "Said I'd only be cursed to lose everything twice. And I believed them. I closed my heart, shut my doors, and thought I could live that way. But then you came, unexpected, unwanted by the world. And somehow, Clara," his voice faltered as he turned to her, eyes raw with honesty, "you became the answer I never thought I'd get." Clara's breath caught, tears shimmering in her eyes. For so long, she carried the ache of being unwanted. Cast aside, forgotten, treated as a shadow rather than a soul. Yet here, under the glow of moonlight and the tenderness in Jacob's voice, she felt something she never thought possible. Belonging. Her hand trembled as she reached for his. "All my life," she whispered, "I've been searching for a place that felt like mine. And tonight, sitting here with you, I think I've finally found my home." For a heartbeat, they only looked at each other, the silence now charged with something deeper than words. Jacob lifted his hand, rough from years of work, and gently cupped her face. She leaned into his touch as if she had been waiting for her whole life. Their lips met in a slow, tender kiss, not fiery or desperate, but healing, the kind of kiss that stitched broken pieces back together. When they finally pulled apart, the porch no longer felt lonely, the cabin no longer haunted. It was no longer just a shelter against storms or a place of grief. It was home. And in that quiet night, under the wide, forgiving sky, they both knew their hearts had finally found where they belonged. The days after their confession carried a quiet but powerful shift. The ranch no longer echoed with loneliness. Instead, it pulsed with warmth. Clara's laughter wove through the fields like sunlight breaking through storm clouds, and Jacob found himself smiling, without even realizing it. The townsfolk, who once whispered cruel words and doubted her place, began to watch with wary curiosity. Slowly, the whispers faded, replaced by a reluctant respect. The woman they called a stray was no longer an outsider. She was the heart of the ranch. The transformation was undeniable. The once somber ranch, haunted by silence, now rang with sounds of life. The sizzle of meals cooked together, the creak of barn doors opening as chores were shared, the gentle hum of Clara's voice telling stories by firelight. Jacob, who had lived years behind walls of grief, felt them crumbling. Clara hadn't just brought comfort. She had brought him back to life. The land itself seemed to respond, grass standing greener, flowers blooming brighter, as if the soil, too, had found healing in their union. The townspeople took notice when Jacob began walking beside Clara openly in town. No longer silent, no longer guarded. He stood with her proudly. When gossip arose, his steady presence silenced it faster than words could. And when Clara offered kindness to the very people who once scorned her, they had no choice but to see the courage in her grace. With time, respect grew, not because she demanded it, but because she had proven herself through quiet strength, resilience, and love. Yet, the truest home was not built from the town's acceptance, but from what they found in each other. Evenings on the ranch became sacred. Porch dinners under glowing lantern light, stolen glances that held volumes, and laughter that felt like music after years of silence. Jacob no longer saw his cabin as a tomb of memories. With Clara, it was alive, renewed. Where grief once lingered, love had taken root, steady and unshakable. One evening, as the horizon stretched wide and the sky burned with streaks of orange and gold, Jacob reached for Clara's hand. His rough fingers closed gently around hers, and his voice carried with a depth only truth could hold. "You'll never be unwanted again," he said, his eyes unwavering. "You are my heart, my home, forever." Tears welled in Clara's eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of finally being seen, wanted, cherished. She leaned into him, and in that embrace, all the wounds of their past seemed to dissolve. The horizon cleared, the sky endless, a symbol of future unburdened by fear or loneliness. Together, they had built something greater than survival, They had built a forever home. The cabin, once just shelter, now stood as proof of love's quiet power to heal, restore, and transform. And as the stars rose above their ranch, Jacob and Clara knew that whatever storms might come, they would face them side by side, bound by the vow that turned emptiness into eternity.